Welcome to Echoes of Mind. In 1876 Montana, a family hid in the mountains, not to survive the winter, but to decide who in their bloodline was allowed to live and who was buried before dawn. What you're about to hear was never meant to leave the valley. There are secrets that do not survive the light. Some truths are buried so deep that to speak them aloud is to invite something ancient into the room with you. This is one of those truths. In the winter of 1876, a German physician named Dr. Theodore Brennan saddled his horse in the shadow of the Montana mountains, carrying nothing but a black leather medical bag, a rifle, and the kind of knowledge that gets men killed. He was riding toward a cabin 23 miles from the nearest living soul. He didn't yet know that what lay inside would haunt every remaining year of his life, or that by crossing that threshold he would step into a century-old experiment in bloodline purity, selective death, and human breeding that the rest of the world had never dared to name. The snow was a crushing silence, broken only by the sound of hooves breaking through crusted ice. Brennan kept seeing it in his mind. The letter from Jake Harrison, the mail carrier who'd braved the passes too early that spring, writing in a hurried, uneven hand about sounds in the night that aren't made for human throats. About lights burning at hours when no fuel should be wasted. About children with identical faces and eyes the color of frozen rivers. And about the graves, the small graves, lying neatly behind the cabin, each cross made in advance, waiting. You have to understand, Montana Territory wasn't just remote in those days. It was a place where federal authority was a rumor, where the winter could starve a family before neighbor either knew they'd gone missing, and for the right kind of person, or the wrong kind. It was a place where the world's questions could never reach you. The Donnell family had come from Ireland, they said. They'd brought gold, forged papers, and a story polished to perfection. But in the snowbound silence of the high ridges, there were no neighbors to repeat that story. Only the strange rhythms of a household that did not live as other households did, and the faint, cold scent of the earth disturbed too often. Dopper. Brennan had no idea yet that he was riding toward a place where mercy meant killing, where the weak were culled by ritual, and where family loyalty meant something far more terrifying than love. The trail to the Donnell homestead felt less like a road and more like a narrowing throat, swallowing Brennan with each mile until the outside world was gone. The snowbanks rose like walls, the trees pressed in close, and the air itself seemed to thicken with an old, unspoken dread. By the time he reached the valley, the sun was a pale coin sinking behind jagged peaks, casting the land in the color of dying embers. The cabin stood ahead, precise, deliberate, without the rough edges of a typical frontier dwelling. Thick log walls, small heat-saving windows, smoke rising in a steady, disciplined column. Not the home of amateurs. The door opened before he could knock. Patrick Donnell stood framed in the dim light, his eyes that unnerving pale blue, his face carved from something colder than stone. There was no surprise in his gaze, no warmth of welcome. Only the measuring look of a man deciding whether you'd be allowed to step inside. Brennan was led into a single main room, clean to the point of sterility. Every object had its place, nothing out of order, nothing casual. The family sat together in silence. The mother Brig, gaunt and watchful, her hands resting lightly on the shoulders of two daughters whose features were so alike they could have been reflections. The sons, Seamus and Declan, stood in the corner, their postures too rigid for boys their age, eyes flicking toward Patrick before they so much as shifted their weight. Brennan noticed the heat immediately, almost uncomfortably warm, fueled by an abundance of wood that frontier families normally rationed with care. He also noticed the smell. Not the stench of decay Harrison had described in his letter, but a faint lingering sweetness, like flowers left too long in stagnant water impossible to place yet impossible to ignore. Patrick gestured toward a chair as if granting permission rather than offering hospitality. They spoke little at first, conversation thin, functional. Brennan's questions about the winter were met with vague answers, as though the family lived in a place where months could pass without memory. Then he saw it. A small shape near the hearth, wrapped in a faded blanket, rising and falling with shallow breaths. The face that emerged from the folds was an infant's, but the proportions were wrong. Head too large, eyes too far apart, tiny fingers curled in unnatural angles. Brigg noticed Brennan looking and, without expression, pulled the blanket tighter, hiding the child's face. Patrick's voice cut through the room, calm but edged with finality. Some lives are not meant to last here, doctor. Best to let the mountains decide. Brennan's training told him the infant's condition was not immediately fatal. Malformed, yes. Suffering from skeletal deformities, perhaps hydrocephaly. But its breathing was steady, its skin still flush with life. In Vienna or Berlin, it might have survived with care. Here, in the frozen Montana wilds, it had a chance. Only the parents would allow it. But in Patrick Donnelly's eyes, Brennan saw no trace of a man weighing medical options. He saw a verdict already handed down. Brigg kept her gaze fixed on the fire, her hands motionless in her lap. The daughters didn't look at the child at all, their eyes fixed somewhere far away, the way people do when they've learned that noticing can cost them something. Seamus shifted in the corner, jaw tightening, a faint tremor in his hands as if his body wanted to move, but his will had been shackled by years of silent obedience. Declan was the only one who risked a glance at the baby, quick and guilty, before lowering his head like someone who had already said too much in another life. Brennan's instincts screamed at him to intervene, demand they let him examine the child. But the air in that room had a weight to it, not just from the heat of the fire, but from something older, thicker, a shared knowledge that outsiders were not allowed to touch. He tried to press the matter gently, offering to return with supplies, to take the infant into his care for observation. Patrick's mouth curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. But it wasn't kindness. It was the smile of a man who had already decided how a conversation would end before it began. "We handle our own," he said, voice steady, tone final. "Interference only makes God's work harder." The words were rehearsed, Brennan thought. Not born of belief, but of habit. The practiced shield of someone who had said them before, perhaps many times, to many others. The longer Brennan sat, the more he noticed the patterns. The identical bone structure in each face. The way each child's pale eyes caught the firelight the same way. Too much uniformity for chance. This was selection. Deliberate. Calculated. And the infant by the hearth, it wasn't sick enough to justify what was about to happen. No, Brennan realized with a slow, cold certainty. Its only flaw was that it didn't meet the family's design. That night, Brennan did not sleep. Patrick had offered him a bed in the corner room, but the walls were thin and the silence was not complete. Through the muffled crackle of the fire, he heard them, the voices. Not raised in argument or softened in affection, but measured, deliberate, almost liturgical. The family spoke in Irish Gaelic, but the cadence reminded him of ceremonial recitations he had once heard in the catacombs beneath Vienna, where certain societies met under the guise of academic debate. There was a rhythm to it, a series of short phrases, each answered by a chorus of agreement. He didn't need to understand the words to feel their weight. Occasionally, a word in English slipped through. Pure, strength, line. Then, more chillingly, the weak and the choosing. At some point, the baby's muffled cries in the other room, not the loud, desperate wail of a healthy newborn, but the soft, ragged sound of something too exhausted to beg for life. It was met with silence from the family. No one moved to comfort it. The firelight under his door flickered in strange patterns, as if the shadows of moving bodies were passing before it in deliberate, ritualized steps. Brennan found himself gripping the handle of his bag, feeling the weight of the scalpel within, absurdly aware of how little protection it offered. His mind went back to Harrison's letter, the singing that didn't sound human. And now, faintly, under the baby's sobs, he heard its low droning melody, without harmony, without joy, without hope. It wasn't meant to soothe. It was meant to prepare. In that moment, Brennan knew with absolute certainty. The decision about the child would be made before dawn, and it would not be a medical decision. He considered confronting Patrick immediately, but something in his bones told him that if he stepped into that other room uninvited, he would not step out again. Instead, he sat there, memorizing every sound, every pause, every unnatural quiet that followed a cry. By the time the voices ceased and the cabin sank back into stillness, the baby's breathing was gone. Dawn came with a brittle cold that turned every breath into glass. Brennan rose before the family, or perhaps they simply let him believe they were still asleep. He stepped outside, the snow crunching under his boots, and for the first time saw the cabin in full daylight. Behind it, half hidden by the slope of the ridge, stood the cemetery Harrison had described. A row of small wooden crosses, each one weathered but uniform, driven into earth that looked recently disturbed despite the frost. He counted 7. 7 graves for a family that had been in Montana less than 2 years. The spacing was exact, the angles precise, as if plotted on a map. They weren't graves dug in grief. They were compartments in a ledger. The ground between them was packed and smooth, not the uneven mounds of hurried burials. And something else. The smell. Faint, almost masked by the cold, but still there. Not rot exactly, but a kind of preserved sweetness, the same note he'd caught inside the cabin. Crouched near one cross and brushed away a drift of snow. The wood was marked with a date, but not a name. Just the season and year, written in a hand so controlled it looked almost engraved. Winter 1875, a spring 1875, winter 1876. No identities, just times of culling. Behind him, snow crunched again. Patrick was standing there, no coat, no hat, just that same unblinking gaze, as if the cold didn't touch him. "You've found our resting place," he said evenly. "The mountains keep what is theirs." Brennan held his ground, though every instinct screamed to walk away. "Stephen," he said, keeping his voice level. "Stephen, in less than 2 years. That's not the mountain. That's you." Patrick's mouth tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to amusement. "We do what must be done. Our line has survived for centuries because we are willing to make the decisions others can't. Weakness spreads like rot if you let it." Brennan realized then that Patrick wasn't defending himself. He was teaching, as though passing down a creed to a student who simply hadn't accepted it yet. Graves weren't a secret here. They were a statement. And the snow, the distance, the silence of the mountains, all of it was a fortress to ensure that no one who saw them would live close enough to speak about it twice. Back in Helena, Brennan could not shake the image of those 7 crosses, lined in mathematical precision, nor the unflinching calm in Patrick Donnelly's voice. He began his search in the dusty drawers of the territorial archives, tracing the family's arrival in Montana to forged New York residency papers dated 1874. The documents were immaculate. Employment records, rental receipts, parish references. All perfectly aligned, all utterly false. Cross, referencing with Ellis Island's medical inspection logs, revealed something stranger. A notation by Dr. Samuel Morrison, immigration physician, recommending the family for extended medical observation, due to repeated phenotypic anomalies among offspring. His recommendation had been ignored. More digging took Brennan beyond Montana, following faint trails of other Donnell households scattered like seeds across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois. All Irish, all recent immigrants, all with whispered accusations, too many infant burials, sudden departures in the night, children whose faces matched with unsettling precision. When he traced them back across the ocean, the pattern sharpened. County Cork, Ireland. Parish records that seemed at first ordinary until the gaps appeared. Missing baptism dates. Burials with no recorded cause of death. Entire family lines that never married outside a small cluster of interrelated surnames. It was a closed loop, a breeding circle, maintained for generations. And then there was the winter of 1798, a famine year, when one Patrick's great-grandfather, Eamon Donnell, had written in a private journal that core strength lies not in number, but in the unbroken perfection of the line. What is flowed must be returned to God before it spreads. Brennan sat alone with those words. The ink faded but still sharp enough to cut. This was not the desperate superstition of peasants. This was policy. Doctrine. It explained the identical features, the rehearsed phrases, the absence of grief at the graves. Was not merely inbreeding. It was selection, as ruthless as any breeding program in livestock, only hidden beneath the polite veil of family and faith. And if Brennan's calculations were correct, they had been perfecting it for nearly 100 years, long before Montana, long before America. The mountains were just the latest hiding place. He realized then that what he had seen in that cabin was not an isolated sickness. It was one chapter in a much older and far more deliberate experiment. One that had learned to survive by scattering across continents, changing names, and always burying its mistakes in silence. By early summer, Brennan's obsession had hardened into resolve. Donnell Homestead wasn't just a medical curiosity. It was a crime against humanity playing out beyond the reach of any law. But in 1876 Montana, law was a thin, patchy thing, and without evidence beyond his own word, Brennan knew no court would act. He needed proof. Physical, undeniable. Something that would force even the most reluctant territorial authority to move. He returned to the cabin under the pretense of a routine check-up, carrying more than his medical bag this time. Hidden in the false bottom of his satchel was a small tin box lined with oilcloth, just large enough to hold whatever evidence he might recover. The trail was just as he remembered. Silent, suffocating, winding between ridges that felt like they'd been built to keep secrets in. Patrick greeted him at the door with the same stillness as before. But there was a subtle shift in his eyes, as if he already suspected Brennan's purpose. Inside, the family's positions were eerily familiar, almost staged. Brigged by the fire, the daughters busying themselves with domestic tasks, the boys keeping to the edges of the room. No infant this time. Brennan noticed the hearth was burning hotter than necessary for a mild summer day. And then he smelled it again. That faint, sweet undertone, masked by wood smoke. He feigned casual conversation, asking after their health, the winter's toll, the status of their livestock. Patrick answered with polite economy, but the others said nothing unless addressed directly. The walls felt tighter now, as if the space itself was complicit. When Patrick stepped outside to fetch water, Brennan took his chance. He moved quickly to the rear of the cabin, slipping out the back door, and into the small cemetery. The snow was gone, but the earth was fresh, turned over two of the smallest graves, the soil still dark and damp. Kneeling, Brennan pressed his fingers into the dirt. It yielded too easily. The graves were shallow. He reached for his folding spade, the tin box waiting in his satchel like a loaded pistol. But before the blade could bite the soil, a shadow fell over him. Some ground, Patrick's voice said from behind, calm as ever, was not meant to be disturbed. Brennan straightened slowly, his hand still on the spade, and met those pale eyes. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. And beneath it, a certainty that Patrick had seen this moment before, and had already decided how it would end. Brennan's pulse pounded, but he forced his grip on the spade to loosen. Patrick's calm, almost amused gaze was more dangerous than open hostility. The look of a man who already controlled the board. Some ground, Patrick repeated, belongs to the dead, and the dead belong to the blood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Brennan stepped back from the grave, but not out of fear alone. He understood now that he had miscalculated. This wasn't a family hiding in the wilderness out of necessity. This was a family secure enough in its power to know that any witness could be neutralized without consequence. The remoteness of Montana was not the source of their safety. It was only one layer of it. They had other layers. He thought of the forged documents that had fooled immigration inspectors, the untouched gold that had bought their land without question, the invisible trail that had let them leave Ireland without a whisper of pursuit. These were not the resources of uneducated peasants. Someone, or several someones, was ensuring the Donnell line remained untouchable. Patrick gestured toward the cabin. "You're welcome to stay for supper, Doctor. Brig makes a fine stew when the summer root cellars are full." It was an invitation and an order at once. Back inside, Brennan noticed details he'd missed before. A chest of books in Irish and Latin, a set of surgical instruments finer than anything he'd seen in the Helena infirmary, and an embossed leather volume resting on a high shelf where only Patrick seemed permitted to reach. The children moved around these objects with the unconscious avoidance of people raised under strict boundaries. They knew what could be touched and what could not. Over stew, Brennan asked with feigned casualness if they had other family in America. Patrick's eyes flicked toward Brig before he answered. "We have cousins in places a man can disappear into. The line thrives when it's spread, not scattered." That word, thrives, sent a cold current through Brennan. This wasn't survival, it was expansion. Every branch of the family he'd traced in his research might not be an offshoot at all, but a deliberate planting. Colonies meant to grow, to select, to cull, and to perfect. And if that was true, then the Donnell cabin wasn't an isolated horror in the Montana wilderness. It was one cell in a network that spanned oceans, a network that knew exactly how to move unseen and how to remove anyone who saw too much. Brennan waited until the house had sunk into the thick, oppressive quiet that passed for night in the Donnell cabin. He had learned their rhythms. Patrick would sit by the fire until the embers dimmed. Brig would slip into the back room without a word, the children moving like ghosts to their beds. That was when he acted. The embossed leather volume sat high on the shelf, its spine cracked, but its gilt lettering still sharp. The title was in Latin, Liber de Sanguine et Linea, the Book of Blood and Lineage. Pulled it down slowly, careful not to disturb the dust along the shelf's edge. The weight surprised him. It was heavy with more than just paper. Inside, the pages were filled with generations of meticulous records, not of crops or weather, but of births, deformities, and deaths. Each child's entry included physical descriptions so precise they read like anatomical sketches. Skull shape, finger length, eye spacing. Alongside these were terse verdicts written in the same steady hand over decades. Idonis si fit, fragilis e fragila, reascendus, and to be rejected. The rejected had their burial seasons noted, but never their names. Interspersed between the records were long passages in Gaelic and Latin, their meaning clear even without full translation. They were rules, laws of the blood. One phrase repeated often, always in larger script: Melius pauses perfectus quam multis corruptus. Better few perfect than many corrupted. He flipped to the earliest pages, where the ink had browned with age. County Cork entries from the late 1700s described the choosing, in cold, procedural language, as if infanticide were simply another farm chore. Some pages bore strange diagrams. Not medical, but symbolic. Circles within circles, each containing marks like notches on a tally stick. Brennan didn't understand them fully, but he recognized their function, a code for tracking traits across generations. Then, toward the middle of the book, he found something worse. A list of surnames, dozens of them, with locations scrawled beside each. Many matched the families he had found in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois. Others were in places he hadn't yet traced. Kansas, Missouri, even Nova Scotia. The Donnellys were not hiding in Montana. They were maintaining a web of related enclaves, each following the same brutal creed, each culling the weak to protect the line. Brennan's stomach tightened as he realized what this meant. Even if the Montana branch were destroyed, the others would survive, spreading the doctrine quietly, invisibly, until no one could trace it back to its source. And then a shadow moved across the page. Patrick, standing in the doorway, watching him read. Patrick didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, the fire behind him casting his frame into silhouette. Pale eyes catching the light like an animal's in the dark. Brennan closed the book slowly, deliberately, knowing any sudden motion might turn the air in the room from tense to lethal. I wondered. Patrick said at last, his voice quiet but carrying a strange, measured cadence. How long it would take you to touch what isn't yours? He stepped forward, each footfall deliberate, boots silent on the worn plank floor. Most men come here once and never return. You came back, you looked, you dug, and now you've rid. Brennan steadied his breath. What you're doing here, he said, goes against every human instinct. You call it survival. I call it murder. Patrick smiled faintly, not as one amused but as one correcting a child. You call it murder because you think life is sacred. I call it refinement because I know it is not. He took the book from Brennan's hands, not snatching it, but claiming it the way a craftsman might reclaim his tools. Every species culls its weak. Only man, in his arrogance, insists on preserving what drags the whole line downward. We do what the world cannot. What it fears to admit must be done. Brennan's mind raced. If Patrick suspected him of carrying evidence out of the valley, he'd never be allowed to leave. He decided to press a different angle. If you believe this work is so vital, why hide it? Why not proclaim it? Patrick's smile deepened, though his eyes remained cold. Because truth has no power when shouted into deaf ears. It has power when it's whispered to those who can act upon it. And you've already been whispered to, Doctor. Whether you admit it or not, you've seen its logic. Brennan felt the words press against him, subtle and invasive, like fingers searching for a fracture. Patrick wasn't trying to frighten him. He was trying to recruit him. And in that moment, Brennan understood the real danger. Not just that he might be killed, but that some part of him might be persuaded. You've read the book, Patrick said, stepping back toward the shelf. Now you'll decide whether you close it in your mind or open it in your blood. Brennan understood the shift instantly. Patrick was no longer treating him as a trespasser, but as a potential initiate. It was a narrow, dangerous space to stand in, but it was the only one that offered even the faintest chance of leaving the valley alive. He kept his voice measured, his eyes locked on Patrick's. If your goal is preservation, then surely you need minds as much as bodies. Someone to carry the knowledge forward. Patrick tilted his head slightly, studying him the way a falcon studies the twitch of a mouse's tail. You think I haven't considered that? Do you think you're the first to stand here and claim understanding? Brennan held his ground. "I think I'm the first with the training to improve it." The fire popped behind them. A sharp, dry sound that seemed to punctuate the risk in every word. Patrick stepped closer, close enough for Brennan to smell the faint metallic tang beneath the scent of smoke. The scent of blood, not fresh, but soaked into the very grain of the man's skin. "Improvement," Patrick repeated slowly, almost tasting the word. "You speak like a man who believes the work is flawed. I speak like a man who knows every system can be refined," Brennan said, letting the hint of shared purpose slide into his tone without letting it touch his conviction. He had no illusions. One wrong inflection, one flicker of disgust, and he'd be lying in an unmarked grave before the moon set. Patrick's eyes narrowed in thought. In the silence, Brennan could hear the faint stirrings of movement in the back rooms. The family listening, creak of floorboards under bare feet, the subtle shift of shadows in the doorway. This was not just Patrick's decision. They were all weighing him, measuring him against some internal scale. At length, Patrick turned toward the shelf, replaced the book with deliberate care, and spoke without looking back. "The mountains test a man, Doctor. They strip away the illusions he carries from the cities, from the softness of law and morality. You've survived 2 journeys here already. Perhaps you'll survive the 3rd. Brennan didn't ask what he meant by that. He knew. The next time he came, there would be no pretense of medical care, no thin veneer of civility. It would be the choosing. And this time would be the one weighed in their ledger. Brennan left the cabin, just as the last light blew out of the valley. The trail ahead swallowed in a twilight that seemed to arrive too fast, as if the mountains themselves were eager to close around him. Patrick had not told him to go, but neither had he invited him to stay. A dismissal without words, the kind that carried more weight than a shouted command. The air outside was sharp and still, but there was movement in it. Not the wind, not animals. Something that kept just out of sight, pacing him from the tree line. At first, Brennan told himself it was imagination, the residue of tension still clinging to his nerves. But then he saw it, a flicker of pale eyes in the dim light, level with his own, vanishing before his mind could fully register them. He kept walking, resisting the instinct to look back. He knew predators, human or otherwise, read that as weakness. Trail wound through a narrow cut between ridges, the snowmelt pooling into dark, glassy puddles. Every sound carried here the crunch of his boots, the faint metallic rattle of the spade in his satchel, almost imperceptible echo of footsteps that matched his pace too perfectly to be chance. He did not break stride. The rules of the frontier were simple. If you ran, you declared yourself prey. Instead, let his mind work through the possibilities. Patrick wouldn't kill him in sight of the cabin. Too much risk of leaving evidence that might draw questions, however unlikely. No. If the Donnellys wanted him gone, they'd make it look like the mountains had claimed him. A misstep, a fall, a disappearance into the deep timber where wolves and weather erased all trace within hours. As the trail widened and the moon slid above the ridge, Brennan forced himself to stop. He turned deliberately, scanning the shadows. Nothing. No movement. No eyes. Just the sound of his own breathing and the distant, rhythmic creak of something swaying in the wind. He waited, every nerve pulled tight. Then turned back toward Helena, not easing his pace until the valley fell completely behind him. He knew now that leaving had not freed him. The Donnellys would not let him vanish into the world, carrying what he'd seen. Somewhere out there in the dark, they were already deciding whether his name belonged in their book. And if it did, he knew exactly what verdict they would write beside it. By the time Brennan reached Helena, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin, but he didn't allow himself the luxury of rest. Every hour he waited was an hour the Donnellys, could close their circle around him. He locked himself in his small rented room above the apothecary, bolted the door, and began to lay out every piece of information he had gathered. The forged documents, the names from the leather volume, the Ellis Island notes, the graveyard pattern. It wasn't enough. Any one of these things could be dismissed as coincidence or the unfounded suspicions of an outsider. He needed something irrefutable, something that could be put into the hands of a territorial judge or a newspaper editor and force them to act. That meant going back. But this time, he would not go alone, and he would not go empty-handed. He began discreetly questioning men who had reason to hate the mountains. Miners driven off claims by violence, trappers who had lost family in disappearances never investigated. A few knew the Donnell name, though most only as a whisper attached to warnings about the people who don't come down for winter. One old prospector in a whiskey haze muttered something about the blue-eyed ones and crossed himself. But finding men willing to ride up that trail was another matter. Fear in the territory was a quiet thing. It lived in the spaces between sentences, in the averted gaze when certain topics were raised. Brennan realized then that whatever the Donnellys were, their reach extended farther than the valley. He began preparing alone. Supplies were purchased in scattered shops under different names. A revolver from a gunsmith who asked no questions. A small, wrapped bundle of quicklime from the tannery. Not for construction, but to make certain that what he intended to bring back could not be dismissed as fabrication. His plan formed with grim clarity. He would return to the graves, exhume one of the most recent, and carry the evidence back before the family could stop him. It was a gamble measured in hours. Anything longer, and he knew the Donnellys would sense the intrusion. But in the quiet hours before dawn, as he sat loading the revolver in the lamplight, Brennan felt the cold certainty that even if he succeeded, he would never be free of them. He would only have moved from being their target to being their enemy. And enemies of the line did not live long. Brennan chose a night when the moon was thin and the air heavy with the smell of rain, kind of night when sound carried strangely and shadows merged into one another. He left Helena without a word, taking the long way around to avoid the main trail, following game paths and old prospector cuts until the black shape of the ridge loomed against the starless sky. The ride was silent except for the muffled thud of hooves in damp earth, his mind turning over every possible outcome, each darker than the last. By the time he tethered the horse in a stand of spruce, cabin's faint outline was just visible through the trees. No light in the windows, no smoke from the chimney. He moved on foot now, keeping low, his breath slow and measured. The graves were exactly where he'd left them, neat as ledger lines. The earth over two of them still looser than the rest. He chose the smaller of the two, kneeling with the spade in hand, working in silence broken only by the wet scrape of metal through soil. Every few minutes he stopped, head tilted, listening for the crunch of footsteps or the whisper of movement in the trees. The ground gave way faster than he expected, the scent rising from it both earthy and metallic. The smell of decay wrapped in the lingering sweetness he'd noticed inside the cabin. When the spade struck wood, stomach tightened. The box was small, crude, nailed shut without care for finish. Made for speed, not reverence. He pried it open slowly, not out of respect but to avoid the noise. Inside, swaddled in cloth stiff with age, was the child. The proportions were wrong, just as he'd remembered from the hearth weeks before. The swollen skull, the curled fingers, the narrow, twisted spine. But there was something else. Around the infant's neck was a thin strip of leather, holding a small brass disc engraved with markings that were neither English nor Gaelic. It was the same symbol Brennan had seen in the diagrams in the leather book. a circle within a circle, intersected by a cross of uneven arms. He slipped the disc into his pocket, wrapped the remains in oilcloth, and placed them into the tin box he'd brought. The earth was already sliding back over the hole when he heard a single, deliberate footstep behind him, followed by the unmistakable click of a revolver being cocked. Brennan didn't turn right away. Every instinct told him that sudden movement would end with a bullet in the base of his skull and the wet earth closing over him instead of the child. He kept his hands where they were, fingers loose on the spade, and listened. The breathing behind him was steady, unhurried. Not the rag pull of a man in panic, but the slow control of someone certain they held all the power in the moment. "Stand up," the voice said. It wasn't Patrick. It was younger, higher, with the faintest trace of tremor beneath its surface, like a wire pulled too tight. Brennan rose slowly, turning just enough to see the figure illuminated by the thin smear of moonlight breaking through the clouds. It was Seamus, the eldest son. The revolver in his hands looked heavy, his grip stiff, but his pale eyes burned with something more complicated than obedience. "Father said you'd come back," Seamus said. His words were rehearsed, but the way his jaw worked told Brennan this moment hadn't been easy for him. Brennan glanced at the boy's hands. No finger on the trigger yet, just resting alongside it. That gap was his only advantage. "Then he knows why," Brennan replied, keeping his voice low, measured. "And he knows what I found." Seamus' gaze flicked toward the tin box at Brennan's feet, then back to his face. There was no curiosity there, only wariness, as though he already knew exactly what was inside. "Put it back," the boy said. "Cover it and leave." Brennan took a slow step forward, just enough to test the distance. Seamus didn't move back, but the revolver dipped, almost imperceptibly. "You've seen what they do," Brennan pressed. "How many times have you stood out here in the dark and watched them decide who lives and who doesn't? How many times has it been your hands on the shovel?" The boy's breathing hitched, just enough to betray the fracture. For a moment, the mask slipped, and Brennan saw it, guilt, raw and buried under years of indoctrination. But then Seamus' grip tightened again. "You don't understand," he said, though the tremor in his voice made it sound less like conviction and more like a plea. "It's not them I'm afraid of if you take that box. It's the others." "The others," Seamus repeated, the words tasting of something he feared even more than his father's wrath. His eyes darted to the dark tree line as if expecting shapes to step forward at any moment. "You think this place is the whole of it?" he asked, his voice dropping low. "It's not even a piece. We're just one branch. There are families, dozens, scattered across the territory, back east, in Canada, even across the ocean. We all follow the same rules. And they watch us, always." Brennan's mind locked onto the implications. Patrick wasn't the head of a hidden dynasty. He was just a caretaker, guarding one node in a network so sprawling that cutting it down here would be like trimming a single root of a vast, unseen tree. "Who?" Brennan pressed, keeping his tone sharp enough to hold the boy's attention. Seamus shook his head. "We're not told names. Only the signs to look for. The ones who visit don't speak much. They just ask if the ledger's in order, if the graves are deep, if the line stays pure. And if it doesn't." His eyes flicked away again, and Brennan caught the faint shiver in his shoulders. "Then we're replaced." The wind shifted, bringing with it the faintest scent of wood smoke, but not from the cabin. It was sharper, fresher, as though someone had lit a fire closer, out here in the trees. Brennan felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. "Seamus," he said evenly. "If they're watching, they already know I'm here, which means the only question left is whether you want me to leave breathing." The boy's jaw clenched, torn between the weight of his orders and the pull of something in Brennan's voice. An appeal to whatever remained of him that hadn't been shaped by the family's creed. Then, faint in the distance, a sound cut through the night, the crunch of multiple footsteps on wet ground, deliberate and in unison. Seamus' eyes went wide. "They're here," he whispered, the barrel of the revolver lowering as if by reflex. "Not my father. Not my family. The others." Brennan bent, scooping up the tin box without breaking eye contact, his mind already shifting from negotiation to escape. He knew then that this night was no longer about getting out unseen. It was about getting out alive before the network decided to erase them both. The footsteps were closing in, slow but steady, like hunters driving game toward a kill zone. Brennan's grip tightened on the tin box, cold metal sweating against his palm. Seamus turned toward the sound, his revolver no longer pointed at Brennan, but held low at his side, the faint tremor in his arm betraying the battle between fear and training. "We need to move," Brennan said. The boy hesitated, torn between obedience to his blood and the instinct to survive. "If they find you here with me," Brennan pressed, "they'll bury you in one of these graves before dawn and send another in your place." The words landed. Seamus' pale eyes flicked to the neat row of crosses, then to Brennan. Without another word, he motioned toward a narrow deer track that veered away from the main trail. They moved quickly but without running. Seamus warning in a low voice that movement in panic would draw the others faster. "They're not like us," he whispered. "Not even like my father. You won't hear them until they want you to. You won't see them unless they want you to." Brennan didn't ask what he meant. The night was answering for him. Twice they caught the faint flicker of motion between the trees. Shapes too tall and too still to be mistaken for animals. Pale suggestion of faces that seemed to glow faintly in the dark before melting back into shadow. The trail narrowed, forcing them single file, the silence between them broken only by the occasional crack of a branch far too heavy for a deer. Every step was a calculation. How much distance could they put between themselves and the watchers before the watchers decided to close the gap? "There's a cut in the ridge ahead," Seamus said, his voice just above breath. "If we reach it, they can't follow without making noise. But once we're there, you go. You don't look back. You don't wait for me." Brennan started to protest, but Seamus stopped dead in his tracks, his gaze fixed on the trees to their left. A figure was standing there now, no longer hiding, its face obscured by a dark hood, but its eyes cold, glacial, visible even in the gloom. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply tilted its head slowly, as if memorizing them. Then another figure stepped into view on the other side of the trail. They weren't hunting anymore. They were closing the trap. The forest seemed to lean in, the trees drawing closer, their black limbs knitting together above like the beams of some vast, rotting cathedral. The two figures on either side of the trail didn't advance, but their stillness was worse, an assurance that the rest of the circle was already in place. "Move," Seamus hissed, stepping backward without taking his eyes off them. Brennan shifted the tin box to his left hand, keeping his right free to draw the revolver under his coat. The pale eyes of the watchers never left him. He couldn't tell if they were men or something shaped to resemble men. Their movements, or lack of movement, felt wrong, as if they'd stepped out of rhythm with the rest of the living world. They began toward the cut in the ridge, steps measured to avoid the snap of twigs. But Brennan knew the sound of pursuit when he heard it. The others were moving now, their footfalls light but coordinated, closing in from angles that cut off every path except forward. The air grew heavier, the smell of damp earth mixing with something acrid, metallic, like old blood in wet iron. Seamus reached the start of the incline, glancing back just long enough for Brennan to see the panic starting to break through his practiced mask. "Go," the boy barked, louder than before, and in that instant the watchers broke their stillness. They came fast, faster than Brennan expected, their strides unnaturally long, closing the space with a predator's precision. Brennan fired once into the dark, not aiming to kill, but to shatter the perfect silence they carried with them. The gunshot cracked through the trees like a lightning strike, and the forest seemed to shudder in response. The figures slowed, only for a moment, but it was enough. Seamus was up the incline in 3 bounding steps, Brennan close behind, tin box thudding against his thigh with each stride. Roots clawed at his boots, stones slipped underfoot, but they didn't stop until they broke through to the ridge top, where the ground leveled out and the trees thinned. Behind them, the watchers had halted, just short of the incline, their pale eyes still fixed upward, unblinking. They weren't chasing anymore. They were waiting, as if they knew something Brennan didn't. "Thee won't follow past here," Seamus said, breathless. "But they don't have to. You're marked now. They'll know you anywhere you go." Brennan rode through the night without stopping, the ridge falling away behind him. The image of those pale, unblinking eyes etched into his mind like frost on glass. By the time the first gray light of dawn bled into the sky, the roofs of Helena were just visible through the low mist clinging to the valley. Relief should have come then. The familiar smell of wood smoke, the muffled clatter of wagons on frozen ruts. But instead there was a weight in his chest that told him safety was an illusion already gone. Dismounted in the alley behind the apothecary, moving quickly to his rented room. The tin box never left his grip, not even to light the lamp. He unwrapped the oilcloth, confirming the remains were still there, the brass disc gleaming faintly in the weak light. Proof, enough to make anyone who saw it believe. But when he glanced toward the window, the relief curdled. Across the street, leaning against the wall of the blacksmith's shop, was a man he'd never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, his coat too fine for the territory, his hat pulled low. Even from here, Brennan could see the pale gleam of his eyes. A second figure moved at the far corner, speaking quietly to the stable boy, pressing a coin into his palm. The boy pointed up toward Brennan's window. His mouth went dry. He closed the curtain and stepped back into the dimness. They hadn't followed him from the valley. They'd arrived ahead of him, which meant the network was faster than he'd imagined, their reach stretching like invisible wire across every settlement worth naming. A knock sounded downstairs. 2 raps, precise, not the impatient pounding of a stranger. Brennan's landlord answered, the murmur of voices rising, just enough for him to catch a single phrase. "We're here on family business." Footsteps climbed the stairs. Slow, deliberate. He slid the brass disc into his pocket, wrapped the remains again, and grabbed the revolver. The first shadow darkened the crack beneath his door, then paused, as if whoever stood there was listening for the rhythm of his breath. Brennan realized then that escape might no longer be the question. The question was whether the knowledge he carried would die with him in this room, or whether he could force it into the world before the Donnellys and their pale-eyed brethren sealed the ledger on his name. The door didn't break open. It eased inward with the patience of someone who knew there was nowhere left to run. 2 men stepped inside, their movements perfectly synchronized, the air shifting with them like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. Their coats were travel, worn but cut from the same pattern, their hats casting shadows over faces too similar to be coincidence. Not twins, but bred to the same mold. Pale eyes, identical to Patrick's, studied Brennan without a flicker of emotion. One glanced at the tin box on the table, then at the pocket where the brass disc lay hidden. "You've carried something out that doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice flat and unhurried. You'll return it, and you'll forget you ever came to that valley. Brennan tightened his grip on the revolver, his other hand resting on the tin box. I'm not forgetting, he said, his voice low but steady. And I'm not returning it. The man tilted his head slightly, the gesture echoing the watchers in the woods. Then you understand this is where your ledger ends. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Outside, the morning traffic of Helena went on, as though nothing in the world had shifted. Wagons creaking, merchants calling to one another, the town blissfully unaware that a war for a bloodline was being decided in a rented room above the apothecary. Brennan's mind raced through possibilities. He could shoot, but one bullet would never be enough before the other closed the distance. He could throw the remains out the window, force them into public view. But if the others retrieved them first, the truth would vanish with him. And then he remembered Seamus's voice in the dark. You're marked now. They'll know you anywhere you go. Maybe that mark could cut both ways. Brennan's hand shot into his pocket, pulling out the brass disc. He held it up between them, the engraved circle catching the lamplight. You want it, he said, forcing steel into his tone. Then hear me now. The line is not pure. The words were not his. They were from the book, written once in the margins beside a crossed-out name. The effect was instant. The men froze, eyes narrowing, perfect composure cracked by something that looked almost like recognition or fear. Say it again, Brennan said, his voice low and deliberate. Twice, if you want to live long enough to see me fall. Outside the door, more footsteps were coming. The ledger wasn't closed yet. But every man who heard those words, from this moment forward, would never be the same.